Hello, this is Professor Zafari. We've been discussing the current politics in the Middle East. As we know, several countries in the Middle East have fought revolutions in the past few years in order to establish democracy. What does democracy look like in the Middle East? In this lesson, we're going to take a close look at the constitutions of Tunisia and Egypt. Both of these countries fought revolutions, they overthrew totalitarian regimes, and they're in the process of defining democracy on their own terms. So let's take a look at these two constitutions in detail and contrast them with the Constitution of the United States as well as the Constitution of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Let's start with the Constitution of the United States, since we're so familiar with it. And let's focus on the ideology of the Constitution of the United States. As we all know, the Constitution has been interpreted differently throughout the years. In the initial years of our country, the rights that the Constitution laid out were not given to all people. So the preamble to our Constitution begins with the phrase, "We the people." And it continues, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." And then the next essential element of our Constitution is that it sets out the three branches of power. And of course we know that the legislative powers are held with Congress, the executive power is held with the President, and the judicial power is held with the Supreme Court and our court system. So this three-branched government is something that we also hold as significant to create a checks and balances system and to make sure that no one branch exceeds the power allotted to it. So let's contrast this Constitution then with the basic law of governance in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia lays out a general premise for its governance. It's not a constitution as we would consider it, but we want to take a look at this document in order to contrast it with constitutions laying out a democracy. So, the document laying out the basic law in Saudi Arabia begins with the phrase from the Quran that begins almost every chapter of the Quran. "In the name of God, the compassionate, the most merciful." And it is really something to be expected that the document and many documents would start with this phrase, as it is a common phrase that is used to begin a public issuing or to begin a document from a Muslim perspective. So this is not uncommon. But the preamble then continues, "With the help of God, we, Fahd bin Abdul Aziz Al Saud, monarch of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, having taken into consideration the public interest and in view of the progress of the state in various fields, and out of the desire to achieve the objectives we are pursuing, have decreed the following." Chapter 1. The General Principles. Article 1 establishes the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as a sovereign Arab Islamic state. So it's clarifying that it is separate from any other state and its sovereignty lies within itself. Continues by establishing its religion is Islam. Its constitution is Almighty God's book, the Holy Quran, and the Sunnah, which are the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. Arabic is the language of the kingdom, and the city of Riyadh is the capital. So right away, the principles lay out that this is an Arab state and it's an Islamic state based on the foundational texts of Islam. And then Articles 2 and 3 lay out some pretty basic principles. The state holidays are the two Islamic holidays. The calendar will follow the Islamic calendar. As you remember, this is the Hijri calendar, the Hijra calendar. And Article 3 basically lays out the flag of the state. So if we want to contrast these two documents, we can just quickly look that the preamble of the United States' Constitution begins with the phrase, "We the people." So the Constitution is taking for granted that this document represents the will of the people. Whereas the Constitution or the document of Saudi Arabia lays out that it is clearly the monarch that is laying out these principles. And it does specify that it is in view of the progress of the state, and it is taking into consideration the public interest, but it's clearly the monarch who is laying out these principles, not as in the United States Constitution, this phrase, "We the people." The next premise that is significantly different from the United States Constitution is again that the source of legislation for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is based on the Quran as well as the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. So clearly a very strong contrast between these two constitutions. If we look at then at the Constitution of Tunisia, we can see a really interesting contrast and a document that's much closer to the Constitution of the United States. And just to back up one moment and give you the context, the country of Tunisia was the first country to begin a revolution in order to overthrow its totalitarian regime. And though the leader of the country was called a president, he was really a president in name only, as he had usurped the power of the executive branch and was essentially ruling the country individually with his cabinet members. So after the revolution in Tunisia successfully overthrew the president, they worked actually to establish, it wasn't an easy task, but they've established a constitution, and so far of all of the countries that have fought and are still fighting their revolutions, Tunisia has been the most successful in making the transition to a democratic state and in instituting a constitution. So, let's look now at what the constitution of this country looks like. As I mentioned, it's not uncommon for a document from a Muslim community, a Muslim society, to begin with the phrase, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate." And we also need to keep in mind the population of Tunisia is significantly a Muslim population. So we have a Muslim population creating a constitution beginning with the phrase, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate," and it then continues. "We, the representatives of the Tunisian people, members of the National Constituent Assembly, taking pride in the struggle of our people to gain independence and build the state, to free ourselves from tyranny, to affirm our free will and to achieve the objectives of the revolution for freedom and dignity, the revolution of December 17, 2010 through January 14, 2011, with loyalty to the blood of our virtuous martyrs, to the sacrifices of Tunisian men and women over the course of generations, and breaking with injustice, inequity, and corruption." And it's a significant preamble because it's very much celebrating the fact that the revolution earned independence, earned freedom for the Tunisian people. So it begins with this reminder. And again, I would say that there is a strong parallel to the United States' history as it fought to gain its independence from Great Britain. The Constitution continues saying that it is expressing our people's commitment to the teachings of Islam, to their spirit of openness and tolerance, to human values and the highest principles of universal human rights, inspired by the heritage of our civilization, accumulated over the travails of our history, from our enlightened reformist movements that are based on the foundations of our Islamic Arab identity and on the gains of human civilization, and adhering to the national gains achieved by our people. So the preamble is continuing by noting that through the course of Tunisia's history and through the course of the developments of human civilization, we are taking into account all of these developments and putting them into practice in this constitution. The goal, the Constitution states, is to build a participatory, democratic, republican system in the framework of a civil state founded on the law and on the sovereignty of the people, exercised through the peaceful alternation of power through free elections. A political system founded on the principle of the separation and balance of powers, which guarantees the freedom of association in conformity with the principles of pluralism and impartial administration and good governance, which are the foundations of political competition, a system that guarantees respect for human rights and freedoms, independence of the judiciary, equality of rights and duties between all citizens, male and female, and equality between all regions. So this piece of the preamble of the Constitution of Tunisia is mentioning the separation of powers, a significant piece, as we know from our United States Constitution, that a balance of powers is really essential in order to see a democracy thrive. So if we're going to compare the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of Tunisia, there's immediately significant words and phrases that pop out that have strong comparisons. So let's take a look. We, the people of the United States, are trying to form a more perfect union. And the Constitution of Tunisia's preamble says something similar in that it's taking pride to gain independence and build a state. The United States' preamble specifically mentions establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, providing for the common welfare, and securing liberty. Tunisia's constitution doesn't use the same words, but the spirit is quite similar in that it says, we want to build a state to free ourselves from tyranny, to affirm our free will, and to achieve the objectives of the revolution for freedom and dignity. And I think these words, freedom and dignity, relate to the words liberty. To affirm our free will also goes to the idea of establishing domestic tranquility and liberty. So again, not the same exact words, but a very similar spirit. We can continue the comparison by looking at, as I said, the United States' Constitution clearly lays out the separation of powers, and the Constitution of Tunisia is trying to do the same exact thing, to build a participatory democratic system that's based on the separation and balance of powers. And the balance of powers and the three branches of government that Tunisia lays out are pretty similar to what we've laid out. An administration that would be the executive power, an elected system of representation similar to our Congress, as well as an independent judiciary. And I want to emphasize here that an independent judiciary that is free from government coercion and that is also regulated to ensure the absence of corruption is really essential. One of the main problems in the Middle East is that most judiciary systems are incredibly corrupt. Many judges are appointed by corrupt lawmakers, and they're easily coerced to pronounce decisions that are in line with those lawmakers' objectives. In many cases, the judges are corrupt and very open to bribes. So in a civil case, it's often the party that has the most money in order to corrupt the judge wins. So as I stated, It is the country of Tunisia that has most successfully transitioned from a totalitarian state to a democratic state, and it is only Tunisia that has thus far been able to institute a formalized constitution. The countries of Libya and Egypt, who have also fought their revolutions, are still struggling in that transitional state. Let's take a closer look now at the development in Egypt's struggle to create a constitution. Before we begin, I want to give you a little bit of a background. As I mentioned, Egypt fought a revolution to overthrow its totalitarian regime that was led by President Hosni Mubarak for about 3 decades. So this quote-unquote president was being elected over 30 years in what I would call coerced elections. After the revolution successfully ousted Hosni Mubarak, the military took control of the country basically in a transitional state in order to ensure peace. And as we can imagine, it took a while, and they came up with a constitution, they held free elections, and the President Mohamed Morsi was elected. What quickly happened, though, is that the president wanted to exceed the powers allotted to him through the Constitution's outline of the responsibilities of the executive branch of the government. And the people very much rebelled against this idea. They just fought a revolution in order to overthrow a totalitarian regime, so there was a considerable amount of fear that Morsi was overstepping the power allotted to him, so Morsi was forced to step down from office, and a new constitution is being drafted in order to take even more precautionary measures to ensure the separation and balance of powers. So we have here a table that outlines what the 1971 Constitution of Egypt said, what the 2012 Constitution after the revolution stated, and now the updated draft of the Constitution from 2013 that are trying to take even more steps to protect freedoms and democracy. I want to just point your attention to a couple of key things that have changed in the development of Egypt's constitution. First and foremost, let's look at the military. What Egypt learned after its revolution is that the military holds considerable power. The military held the power and ruled the country after the revolution, and it was a struggle to get the military to back down in their power in order for a president to be elected. So what we see in the 2013 draft of the Constitution is that there's a significant point here made that the Minister of Defense is appointed, but the Minister of Defense must be approved by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. If we look then at some of the principles on the freedom of religion, there are some significant differences if we compare the 1971 Constitution to the 2013 Constitution. Freedom of religion is mentioned in the 1971 Constitution, but not to the detail that it's mentioned in 2013. If we look here at freedom of belief, it is simply stated in 1971 that the state shall guarantee the freedom of belief and the freedom of practice of religious rights. Whereas in 2013, the language is stronger. Freedom of belief is absolute, and it is specific that the freedom of practicing religious rituals and establishing places of worship for the followers of revealed religions is a right organized by law. And this is significant in the context that under Hosni Mubarak, many people's freedom of religion was compromised, Muslims as well as Christians. So if we look up here at Article 3 in this category, there's even more specificity laid out, stating that the principles of the laws of Egyptian Christians and Jews are the main source of laws regulating their personal status, religious affairs, and selection of spiritual leaders. So it's clearly laying out that in matters of religion, Christians and Jews shall be able to regulate their own religious institutions and their own religious leaders. And if you remember, this is the precedent that was established in the early Islamic Caliphate, that the Christians and the Jews had the right to follow their own religious laws, and the Constitution is reiterating these laws with specificity. The Constitution also specifically addresses Islamic law, the Sharia. In 1971, the Constitution stated Islam is the religion of the state and Arabic is its official language. And principles of Islamic law are the principal source of legislation. We see this again in the 2012 Constitution, and we see this again in the 2013 Constitution. Now, in the 2012 Constitution in Egypt, it stated the principles of Islamic Sharia, or Islamic law, include general evidence, foundational rules, rules of jurisprudence, and credible sources accepted in Sunni doctrines and by the larger community. So we can see right away by the inclusion of Sunni doctrines that this is to the exclusion of Shia Muslims. And, very notably, in the 2013 draft, this principle is not mentioned at all. So the reason why it's not included is not evident, but what we can see is that there's an attempt to curtail a little bit of the language that insists that Islamic law is going to be the primary way of ruling the new state of Egypt. If we continue, the system of government doesn't change too much. The way that the government of Egypt was laid out in 1971 was meant to be a democracy, and it was meant to be based on a constitution, and it was meant to have a political system that had multiple parties that debated issues and held some kind of democracy. Unfortunately, that's just not what happened. So the language doesn't change too much here, but what we do see very specifically is a change to the presidential term limits. In 1971, there is no mention of presidential term limits. And as I mentioned, the previous quote-unquote president, Hosni Mubarak, had been in office for over 30 years. So in the 2013 draft, it very specifically mentions that the term is for 4 calendar years and the president may only be re-elected once, similar to our American Constitution that only allows a president to serve 2 terms. There's also more specificity when it comes to women's rights in the Egyptian society. In the 1971 Constitution, the language does not specifically protect women's rights. It states that the family is the basis of the society and is founded on religion, morality, and patriotism. The state is keen to preserve the genuine character of the Egyptian family. The state shall guarantee the protection of motherhood and childhood, take care of children and youth. And the state shall guarantee harmonization between the duties of woman toward the family and her work in the society, ensuring her equality status with men in fields of political, social, cultural, and economic life. In the 2013 draft of the Egyptian Constitution, it includes that family is the basis of society, but it goes into much more depth and specificity, stating the state commits to achieving equality between women and men in all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. The state commits to taking the necessary measures to ensure appropriate representation of women in the House of Parliament. It grants women the right to hold public posts and high management posts in the state, and to appointment in judicial bodies and entities without discrimination. It also states that the state is committed to the protection of women against all forms of violence. So there are some really progressive statements here regarding the rights of women. And this is not new for Egypt. I really want to point this out. Egypt actually had a very strong feminist movement even before the 20th century, with many prominent men leading the feminist movement, stating that if there's no equality for women, the society is not going to thrive. So, insisting on equal rights for women is not new to Egypt, but the 2013 Constitution is very much committed to articulating that women do have these rights and that the state is going to take, quote, the necessary measures to ensure that women have those rights. The next section is freedom of the press. And again, to understand why this is significant, we also have to understand that under Hosni Mubarak's regime, there was no freedom of the press. The media in Egypt was controlled by the government and censored heavily by the government. And so even though the 1971 Constitution stated that the freedom of the press is guaranteed and censorship is forbidden, that was not the case. The 2013 Constitution keeps the idea that freedom of press is guaranteed, but it also states that the state shall ensure the independence of all press institutions and owned media outlets in a way that ensures their neutrality and expressing all opinions. So there's a little bit more specificity added here. And under the section addressing freedom of thought and expression, we have this emphasis that freedom of thought and opinion is guaranteed. All individuals have the right to express their opinion through speech, writing, imagery, or any other means of expression and publication. Interestingly, in the 2012 Constitution, there were 2 articles here that stated insulting or showing contempt toward any human being shall be prohibited. And it stated insult or abuse of all religious messengers and prophets shall be prohibited. So what this is addressing here in Article 31 would be something similar to what we see in political cartoons. And many political cartoons have derogatory comments or portray political leaders in a manner that's mocking. So the 2012 Constitution prevented this, and it also specifically mentioned that you may not insult or abuse any religious figure. So this would address situations like the political cartoons we saw representing Prophet Muhammad, or even movies such as The Last Temptation of Christ that many Christians found offensive. But the 2013 does not include these statements. It is simply saying freedom of thought and opinion is guaranteed. And it includes this phrase and this word here, imagery. So that would also include political cartoons. So it's interesting because although many of these expressions will offend people, the Constitution is still guaranteeing that freedom of opinion and expression. The next section I want to bring to your attention is the articles that address political parties. In the 1971 Constitution, it established that citizens have the right to establish political parties, and no political activity shall be exercised nor political parties established on a religious referential authority, on a religious basis, or on discrimination on grounds of gender or origin. So interestingly, the 1971 Constitution very specifically said no political party or activity can be based on a religious premise. In the 2012 Constitution, this language changes somewhat. It states the political system is based on the principles of democracy and shura, a word in Arabic that means taking counsel from multiple people. Citizenship, under which all citizens are equal in rights and duties, multi-party pluralism, peaceful transfer of power, separation of powers and the balance between them, the rule of law and respect for human rights and freedoms. And it states no political party shall be formed that discriminates on the basis of gender, origin, or religion. So the language is more loose here. It does not state that a political party cannot be based on a religious ideology. It simply says that no political party can be based on discrimination on the basis of gender, origin, or religion. So in other words, no political party may be based on the idea that it is only Muslims, for example, who are entitled to the rights of the state. Now in the 2013 Constitution, this language is even more specific. No political activity may be exercised or political parties formed on the basis of religion or discrimination based on sex, origin, sect, or geographic location, nor may any activity be practiced that is hostile to democracy, secretive, or which possesses a military or quasi-military nature. So we have to stop for a moment and wonder, why is the 2013 Constitution being so specific? If we take into account that Egypt has a strong political party by the Muslim Brotherhood that is based on religious ideology, and if we take into account that in the late 20th and 21st century we've seen Islamic regimes in Afghanistan, such as the Taliban, that is based on religious ideology, that discriminates based on religious ideology, and that is also discriminatory based on sex. Egypt has seen these things and wants very much to ensure that they don't happen in their country. Egypt also has a history of skirmishes between Egyptian Christians and Muslims. So there is all of that context that is the background for this 2013 Constitution. And similarly, when we look at this section here on torture, we have to understand the context. Under Hosni Mubarak, the 3 decades that he was in power, Egypt was known as one of the worst countries for torturing its citizens. Egypt and Syria both had horrific records under the United Nations Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations. Both countries systematically tortured people in their prisons, tortured people in their interrogation, and torture was used as a means of instilling fear in order to prevent any political uprising. So, even though the 1971 Constitution stated that human beings shall be treated in a manner that preserve their dignity and no physical or moral harm shall be inflicted upon them, this was not the case. The regime regularly and systematically practiced torture in prisons as well as in interrogation. So in the 2013 Constitution, we see that this article is very specific. All those who are apprehended, detained, or have their freedom restricted shall be treated in a way that preserves their dignity. They may not be tortured, terrorized, or coerced. They may not be physically or mentally harmed, or arrested and confined in designated locations that are appropriate according to humanitarian and health standards. So these changes in Egypt's constitution are really indicative of an evolving society that's very much aware of the challenges it has faced and is very much optimistic for a new and democratic future. So I hope by taking a look at these rather specific points in the development of the Constitution, you can see the trends that Egypt is trying to overcome. As we've seen over the last several years, the struggle for democracy in the Middle East has certainly not been easy. In the country of Syria, the struggle for democracy has led to horrific bloodshed and human suffering. But what I hope you've learned in this lesson is that democracy is very much wanted and needed and being passionately fought for in the Middle East. And many people have argued that democracy and Islam might not be compatible. But I think what you can see in the Constitution of Egypt and in the Constitution of Tunisia is within the preamble that clearly establishes this is a country that is based on Islamic principles, we are also instituting a democracy. So for the people of Tunisia and the people of Egypt and the people of many other Middle Eastern countries, Islam and democracy are perfectly compatible. And they argue that the principles of Islam that ensure human rights are compatible, if not identical, with the human rights that democracy seeks to preserve and protect. Clearly, those constitutions look different from our United States Constitution, but I hope you can see that, especially in the case with the Constitution of Tunisia, there's some very clear parallels and similarities, and in the case with the Constitution of Egypt, there is an evolution taking place that as the Egyptian people go through their challenges, they're working to develop a more and more sophisticated constitution that protects its citizens' equal rights.